Hey everyone, welcome back to the Legends of Sport podcast. I'm your host, as always, Andy Bernstein. So, folks, this episode's guest is somebody I didn't know personally. I got to know him really well through his writing and doing some research, and of course, on this podcast. His name is Mike Sielski. Mike is a sports writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Mike's the book that I'm going to be talking about on the podcast, is this: The Rise, Kobe Bryant, and the Pursuit of Immortality. I didn't know much about Kobe before I met him at 18 years old, that first day, Lakers Media Day in 1996. He came into the league with a lot of hype, but I didn't really know much about him. Through Mike's book, myself and everyone out there who reads it will find out how the Mamba became the Mamba, the young Kobe, how he was so relentless in his pursuit to become the greatest NBA player in history, and everything that went into becoming that player, becoming that person, becoming someone that we love and that we admired and that we miss so terribly now. Thanks to Mike for laying that all out for all of us in his book. And I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Can't wait to get together with Mike at some point, have dinner, and just kick around stories about Kobe because so inspiring. So I hope you all enjoy this episode. I greatly enjoyed preparing for this. I greatly enjoyed talking to Mike, and I'm going to look forward to following up with him. So enjoy this episode with Mike Sielski. And as always, I'll see you guys on the backside. So, welcoming Mike Sielski to the Legends of Sport podcast. Mike, I got to tell you, the first time we're meeting, it's a pleasure to meet you. It's a pleasure to have read your book, to learn so much about Kobe that I didn't know. How you doing, Mike? How's things?
I'm doing great, Andy. Thank you so much for having me. This is a treat and a pleasure, and I'm raring to go here.
Awesome. So, Mike, you're a writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, right?
Mhm.
Um, you wrote this amazing book. I'm holding it up right here. This is it. This is the book, The Rise, Kobe Bryant, and the Pursuit of Immortality. I got to tell you, Mike, I didn't really know anything about Kobe when I didn't know a thing about Kobe when I met him, quite frankly. I just read a couple of newspaper articles. I knew he was this high school phenom, kind of following in the footsteps of Kevin Garnett, who came out of high school right into the NBA the year before. We're in LA. There's a lot of hype about anything that's new and shiny, and there certainly was for this kid. My experience with him was you might have heard, but it was amazing. First time I met him on my set, '96 Lakers Media Day, and anyway, he was so poised, and he said he knew who I was because he had all my posters in his room growing up. And at the time, I had no idea what that meant, you know. And over time, I figured it out after getting to know him and being with him for 20 years. But reading your book, I got to tell you that that's where it all started. You lay it out so beautifully, Mike. Um, so, Mike, I want to take a little bit of a different sort of tact with our interview because you've done so many great interviews. I've read so much about you in the book and the history and how you did it and all that stuff. But I want to kind of find a common thread between your book and my book that I did with him, the
Right.
Mamba Mentality. The first thread that I find, right, is in the subtitle, quite frankly. Okay, your subtitle is The Pursuit of Immortality, right? Subtitle of my book that I did with co-wrote with Kobe is How I Play, right? So let me just explain my thing with him, okay?
Okay.
So we're doing the book. It's this great collaboration. He's, as you can imagine, deeply involved in the book in every single aspect. And we get to the cover, and 900 different versions come from the publisher. He doesn't like any of them. He finally liked the cover that we settled on, and then I saw right before we went to print, I saw the final version of the cover, and it says the Mamba Mentality and subtitle How I Play, right? So I text him. I'm like, dude, you realize it says How I Play, and like you've been retired for 2 years. He goes, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, that's how I play. That's my life. That's how I do it. So, you know, nothing surprised me about it, but that was a little bit of a shocker. Your title, The Pursuit of Immortality, Can you explain it? Because I know there's a lot of stuff to uncover here, but why did you choose that subtitle?
Well, first of all, yes, I think there is more to it than just throwing a subtitle up
Right.
there. I didn't start the research and the writing of this book until after Kobe's death in
Mhm.
January of 2020. So the word immortality was a little fraught, I thought. I wanted that in there, but I wasn't sure about having that in there at the same time for all the obvious reasons.
Mhm.
And I think this ties, Andy, to what you're talking about with respect to how I play and the way that Kobe wanted to keep things in the present tense for himself, even though he was no longer on the Lakers roster.
Mhm.
I think, and this is part of the reason why I think your book and the concept of the Mamba mentality struck such a chord among such a large segment of the national and global populations, is it is kind of Kobe's approach, not just to basketball, but to living, right? It's
Mhm.
his approach to the day to day.
Mhm.
And that was what I wanted to explore in my book, to kind of show how, even at his earliest stages, even when he was a little kid, even when he was living in Italy, even when he comes to the United States permanently and is going to live in Lower Merion Township and become a high school basketball player,
Mhm.
there's something beyond just those stages. There is something, a North Star, if you will, that he is shooting toward and
Mhm.
pointed toward that he might never reach, but that's what's going to guide him. And
Mhm.
he's going to take that journey and devote himself to that journey and sacrifice whatever he needs to sacrifice, whether it's personal or professional or relationships or whatever the case may be, in pursuit of that journey. And I think that kind of is the thread tying what you're talking about with how I play versus the pursuit of immortality. It's beyond just I want to be a great basketball player. Yeah, that's a big part of it, but there's something deeper there than just the sport itself.
Yeah, I mean, very well said. Yeah, I get it. Your book, a lot of your book, you were dependent on in a good way. Um, the treasure trove of tapes, in Kobe's own words, that he and Jeremy Treatman did when he was in high school at the time, right? I mean, you tell this great story about how the tapes were missing, and then Jeremy's like cleaning out his garage or something. He finds this like bagging of tapes is crazy. Um, our book was done in his own words, similar thing. I mean, we're talking, 20 some odd years, 22 years later. But, every single word in the Mamba mentality is from his mouth as well. So, I was just finding so many parallels, man. It was just
Yeah.
just amazing. Um, do you feel, you talk about Kobe being like a spaceman, kind of, quote unquote. That was something that stood out to me in the book. Sort of dropped into Lower Merion. I mean, here's a guy whose family, they moved to Italy when he was a young kid. He's raised in Italy, different culture, different language. All of a sudden, boom, they're back. He's in eighth grade. He's literally dropped into this suburban,
Yes.
basically white, affluent area. He's a black kid having to try to figure it out, not just like culturally, but the language itself.
Yes.
Um, from all the people you talk to, what do you think that, looking back, and you talk eloquently in the book, but what was that transition like for him? Knowing that he had this mission from a little kid, that crystallized that he was going to be the greatest basketball player in the history of the game. But take us back to like that young Kobe, that eighth grader. What do you think that was like?
I think it was a challenge at first,
Yeah.
without question, for all the reasons that you cited, Andy. I mean, and one of the things I tried to do as much as I could in researching and writing the book, um, was put myself in Kobe's shoes for this reason. When it comes to age, we're kind of contemporaries. I'm 47 now. Um, he would be 44 almost. I was a senior in high school uh, when he was a freshman in high school, and our high schools, we both went to public high schools that were very similar. So, in some ways, I tried to put myself in his shoes and thinking, and I also was someone who I started a new high school in ninth grade. I
Hmm.
had gone to Catholic grade school from the time I was in kindergarten until eighth grade, and then I went to my local public high school, Upper Dublin High School. So it was a fresh start for me too. And you know,
Hmm.
I'm learning, I'm meeting new people, and trying to make the transition, and going through all the awkwardness and stuff that any teenage kid at that time in their lives goes through. But I kept thinking this as I was doing the research and thinking about Kobe. At least I knew who Madonna and Paula Abdul were. Like I could speak the quote unquote language
Yeah.
of kids at that time, and Kobe didn't have that advantage.
Hmm.
He didn't know what music was popular. He didn't know what movies were popular, TV shows were popular. He didn't know the slang and the lingo. I describe in the book how he and his sisters would walk through Lower Merion High School, and they would speak Italian to each other because that was what they were used to and what was more comfortable.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and they'd wear dashikis and kind of loud European style clothing at the time,
Hmm.
and they were viewed as different when they got there. And I think, to your point about him being young and driven and seeing things beyond himself, I think it was basketball really that kind of got him through that, and bought him the time and the benefit of the doubt to show to people who he was and who he could be, right?
Hmm.
Because by the end of this time at Lower Merion, he's not just a basketball player. I mean, he's probably the most famous basketball player at that time in the Philadelphia area, right? It's
Hmm.
the Lower Merion High School Aces are a traveling road show by the time he's a senior.
Hmm.
But Kobe at the school is able to move in these different worlds. He's able to be friends with the guys on the basketball team. He's able to be friends with the kids who are in his high school English, honors English class. The other kids who are in the Black Student Union group with him, the Student Voice. He's
Hmm.
able to move in all these different worlds. And the reason he's able to do that is because he's such a good basketball player when he gets there. And people hear of that when he arrives. Um, they know of him in that regard, and they allow him, so to speak, into the world and let him kind of find his way in there, in it.
Yeah. I mean, you talk so eloquently in the book, and you interview so many people that really remember what it was like before Kobe got there. Lower Merion was not basketball powerhouse. It was a suburban high school. I think they reached maybe they had one championship in their history before him or whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
one or two. They
yeah,
hadn't won one
and
in a long time.
you have a quote in the book that says, quote, as much as his environment there shaped him, he shaped it even more, right? Um, Doug Young, his great friend, teammate, who I've become very good friends with, he said, quote, it was like a royal family had arrived at Lower Merion. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much gold in this book. It's just amazing. Um, Greg Downer, his coach, talks about the Kobe experience, right? Yeah.
This was unlike anything anyone at that school had experienced
Right.
before.
Yeah.
I mean, it really was. It's kind of this neat balance between being new and fresh and revolutionary, and
Hmm.
being old school at the same time. Because, you think about the high school basketball landscape nowadays,
Hmm.
how many great teenage players play for their hometown public school teams. I
Hmm.
mean, most of them now go play at Montverde Academy or IMG Academy, or they
Hmm.
transfer to a kind of Tony prep school or something like that. And Kobe
Yeah.
played for his neighborhood high school, and that affected that community and that school, and in turn, it affected him in some
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah, and you talk about how basketball was his way in socially, right? So through basketball, through this passion, he was able to kind of assimilate and make friends. And Kobe throughout his whole life, I mean, from a little kid, really had a very small inner circle of people. I mean, that continued all the time I knew him in the NBA. There are very few people that were there with him, close knit family, but then also his NBA family as well, the people he trusted, right?
Yeah.
Um, it to me it just seems like, I'm just trying to picture what Lower Merion must have been like, and the fact that he got so much grief about not being quote black enough,
Hmm.
and that he didn't play against the street ballers in Philly, but yet he did play against the street ballers in Philly. And you point that out. I mean, I
Yeah.
didn't know that. I thought he was, he was at this suburban high school. He made them great. They won the state championship, but he actually honed his skills on the street. He played against um, actual 76er players, right? Because
Hmm.
of his relationship with John Lucas. All stuff that I just didn't know. I mean, how fascinating was that for you to find all that out?
It was amazing. It really was.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I remember that time, and I didn't know Kobe then.
Mm,
I met him a couple of times. Once he was with the Lakers, and would interview him and talk to him whenever he came to Philadelphia when the Lakers would play the Sixers. But I remember that time very well of the rise of Kobe and
mm,
the fact that there was this perception and this kind of doubt surrounding him, particularly his senior year, in the early stages of it, because the scuttlebutt about him jumping straight to the NBA from high school was everywhere.
mm.
And at the time, I was an undergraduate at LaSalle University, where Joe, his father, was the assistant basketball coach. So all of the students there, and I was a student and an editor and a writer for the school newspaper, we were all kind of operating under this delusion that maybe Kobe would decide to come to LaSalle and
Right.
rescue our program. But
Yeah.
um,
Mm,
I digress in that regard.
yeah.
Um, the thinking was that because he went to Lower Merion,
Mhm.
which was, as you said, a suburban school, not a real rich basketball tradition. Philadelphia, through its public high schools and the Philadelphia Catholic League, and even some other suburban programs, has a rich high school
Mhm.
basketball culture, and one that's very, very competitive. And so the idea that this kid from this high school would be arrogant enough to think that he's going to jump straight to the NBA,
Yeah.
he had doubters everywhere. And to go back and to learn how he came to the conclusion to take the risk on himself that he could make that jump,
Mhm.
that I'm playing in the Sunny Hill League in the summertime, and I'm going against these other guys who are going to be D1 ball players and eventually NBA players, and at the time really good players as teenagers, and I can test myself against them. And I find that I hold up. And then that summer that you mentioned of 1995, when John Lucas invites him to come scrimmage and play pickup games against mostly players for the Sixers at the time,
Mhm.
that to me is the whole turning point.
Yeah.
Once he is going toe to toe with guys like Jerry Stackhouse and Vernon Maxwell and Rick Mahorn and Sean Bradley. And Sean Bradley is even picking him up at the Bryant's house in the morning to drive him to St. Joseph's University to play in these games.
Crazy.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and once he sees that he's holding his own against those guys, it's like, yeah, I don't need college.
Mhm.
I know how good I am and how good I can be. And my rocket ship is taking off.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. I mean, you have a moment in his life when he was what 4 years old. There was this like martial arts class that he was in. I mean, to me, if I was going to find the birthplace of the Mamba mentality or the Black Mamba, it might be that moment. Talk
Mhm.
about that moment at 4 years old.
Sure, he's in Texas. Believe he's in Houston. Joe was playing for the Rockets at the time and signs Kobe up for a karate class. And Kobe's 4 years old, and he talked about this in a magazine article years and years later that I dug up, where he's kind of getting beat up. He's a little afraid to go in the ring against a bigger, stronger, more experienced kid,
Hmm.
and the sensei keeps exhorting him, "No, you go in there, you fight him." And so Kobe gets in there and he takes some shots, but he gives it back too. And he comes away from the battle. And how much of this is apocryphal and how much of it isn't is kind of, I think, depends on how well you know Kobe and what you think he might say when
Yeah.
remembering a situation like this. But he came away from that as kind of a learning a lesson like, hey, I can test myself and I'll be all right. I'll survive and I'll come out stronger for it. And I
Mhm.
think, again, that gets back to what you just mentioned about his willingness to put himself in uncomfortable situations, even as a young kid,
Mhm.
and test himself there. It's not good enough for me to be the best player at Lower Merion High School in the Central League in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I've got to test myself against the very best among my peers in the Philadelphia area. I've got to play against the best AAU players around the country.
Mhm.
And you see that translate to the point where at the end of the book, I get into his attitude and I'm sure you saw this, once you got to know him,
Mhm.
his attitude once he gets to the Lakers, where he's a 17, 18-year-old kid on a team with Shaquille O'Neal and Eddie Jones and
Mhm.
Byron Scott and all these veteran players, a club that is expected to challenge for an NBA title. I mean, this is the Lakers, right? And he expects Del Harris to defer to him as an 18-year-old rookie. Like, he's not letting me shoot. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to lead us to the championship. There's no sense of, hey, I got to bide my time. There's like, oh no, I'm here and Shaq's here and we're going to win right away. And
Yeah.
only a coach who doesn't use me the right way is going to mess this up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you see all those threads connecting in so many ways.
Yeah. I mean, I remember the scenario you talk about the guidance counselor who, you know, basically told him, this is a dream, but how many guys get to the NBA? Really think about something else. I had that happen to me. I came out here to California to go to basically photography school, and they told me, sports photography, what are you, nuts? I mean, nobody makes a living doing that. You got to go out and do commercial photography, you got to do fashion photography, and that's where the money is. And I said, well, a few people have succeeded, so I'm hopeful I'm going to be one of them. um but I'm just looking at my notes. You obviously, it's legendary, the fact that he's in Italy. He's a young kid. His grandfather is sending over tapes of Magic and Michael, and I remember those tapes. A lot of those tapes have my photos on the covers of them and stuff. And he's like devouring them. And you have a great quote from the sister Shea that said, "quote, he would watch those games like they were a movie, and he knew what the actors were going to say next." End quote.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Um, then he wants to go, he gets the opportunity to meet Michael Jordan. And you know, that was an amazing quote that you had at the opening of the chapter 16, where you say, quote, from Kobe's mouth, right? From the tapes that you had. You said, quote, I definitely one day want to sit down with him, Michael, and talk with him. And hopefully he can give me some advice so I can break all his records. I mean, the balls of this guy was just unbelievable, right?
Yeah, it really was.
Yeah.
And that first meeting, as I describe it, I mean, he meets Michael briefly
Yeah.
when Kobe is a freshman at Lower Merion. Joe brings him to a Bulls Sixers game, and they kind of shake hands. And but it's Kobe's senior year in March of 1996, where Joe brings him back to a game, and John Lucas leads him down to the Bulls locker room at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. And there's a
Mm.
gaggle of media around Michael, and Michael sees Kobe and says, "Hey, Kobe, how you doing?" And at first, Kobe is kind of surprised. Oh my gosh, Michael
Yeah.
Jordan knows who I am. How does he know who I am? But in that moment, the way Kobe talks about it in real time on those tapes, he's not overwhelmed. He's not stuttering or sputtering when he's talking to the greatest athlete on the planet.
Mhm.
He's very confident, and he's okay. This
Yeah.
is who Michael is now. He's lobbying me to go to the University of North Carolina, and he doesn't know that I would never go to the University of North Carolina because I would never have my own identity there. I would always be the guy who just came after Michael.
Right.
And I want to be something more than that. And
Yeah.
to hear those tapes, as you said, Andy, and to be able to kind of understand what he was thinking at that stage of his life was so precious and so valuable in being able to write this book. Because um, even if I had gotten the chance to speak to Kobe, when he was 40, 41, and older,
Mhm.
about this time in his life, I don't think the perspective and the honesty of what he was saying would have been there in the way they were on these tapes.
Yeah, he was just so tunnel vision. He knew exactly what he wanted. I mean, and like you talk about in the book, he wanted everything fast, right? He wanted everything to
Yes.
happen fast. He wanted to get to the NBA fast, forget about college. He wanted to get married. He wanted to become a dad. He wanted to win championships, get into the Hall of Fame, all that
Yeah.
stuff. And I saw that with him too. When we were doing our book together, um, getting back to him watching tapes over and over again, right? And then I remember, like, halfway through his career, he would come to me. Well, actually, earlier in his career, he'd come to me and say, Andy, I need pictures of this guy and that guy. And, of course, the greats, Magic, Bird, Jordan, but like obscure guys too. And I'd say, okay,
Mm.
and can you make me some prints? And I would make prints. Then he would hang them up in his locker, right? And I don't know what he's doing with this. finally, when we actually are doing the book together, I ask him, like, what was the deal with that? He goes, those were my muses, man. That I was
Hmm.
studying everything in those pictures. I told you that I had all your posters in my room. They might have been nice pictures, but I was studying like Michael's muscle tone and how he was leaning, when he's going in for that dunk on the poster. And then our book was exactly that, process and craft. He wanted to illustrate. I mean, here's a funny story you probably don't even know. Um, the picture of he and Michael, the first picture in the book, um, Kobe's caption to that picture is everything I'm doing in this photo is wrong. Right. So he's actually breaking
Yeah.
down his own game. I mean, it's
Yes.
unbelievable, right? I mean, the guy,
It's amazing, and it
yeah,
leads to what I think kind of defined him as a player. If you want to
yeah.
just focus on that aspect of him in his life, which was this incredible melding of technique and fundamentals
Hmm.
with that grace and athleticism. Who looked better taking a jump shot than Kobe Bryant,
Hmm.
right? I
Hmm.
mean, the form was just impeccable. And yet, if you talk to people who really know basketball, they'll talk about his footwork and they'll talk about, how he was able to get in position to make some of the shots that he made. And the only way that he could get to that point was through looking at your photos and understanding how others did it and kind of, still shotting those moments in his head so that he could carry them out himself hundreds of thousands of millions of times on the practice court and in scrimmages and things like that. So that when it comes time to spin to his left and lean in and keep the defender on his right shoulder and put the shot up with his left hand, he's able to do it because he's already done it so many times.
Yeah, it's crazy. I remember so many times being on the plane with the team coming back after a late game or going to the next game, the back to back. Everybody's asleep. There's one guy who's awake, looking at tape over and over. USA basketball, the same thing. 2008. That had a young LeBron, they had a young Melo, D Wade. They're all we're in Vegas for training camp. These guys, they're in Vegas, right? Who's the first guy in the gym?
Yeah.
who's, who's the last guy at the gym? I mean, and they all saw that. And he was such an inspiration. And I really felt that going back to his high school days, what you described, because, guys like Robbie Schwartz, who's not a gifted basketball player, or Doug, or even Greg Downer as a coach. Greg saw this as obviously a once in a lifetime experience for him. Um, I just, it just kind of boggles my mind. I mean, you have a quote in the book that says that, quote, he was there to prepare, not to play, right? That his whole like high school experience was to prepare for the next step. And
Yeah,
that was
you're
amazing.
100% right. The one anecdote I think of in the book to that point, Andy, is um, Lower Merion went 4-20 Kobe's freshman year.
Mhm.
Okay, which ought to be impossible when you think about it. If you have Kobe Bryant on your team, how do
Yeah.
you go 4-20,
Yeah.
even if he's a freshman?
Yeah.
But that following summer is the summer of 1993. Now, I remember that summer really, really well personally. That was the summer between my senior year of high school and my freshman year of college.
Hmm.
And so I enjoyed that summer a lot. And one of the things that always stands out in my memory is as an 18-year-old kid, one of the things I did a lot that summer was go see movies.
Hmm.
Jurassic Park came out in
Right.
the summer of 93. The
Yeah.
Fugitive came out in the summer of 93. I was at a movie theater every weekend to see one of these big blockbuster popular movies.
Hmm.
And one of Kobe's teammates, Guy Stewart, talked to me about that summer
Mm.
and said to me, we would all get together and hang out as guys. We're doing the same things that you, Mike Sielski, did, and that all these high school kids at that time did. We're hanging out, we're playing pickup, we're going to see movies. It's like Kobe never went to see a movie with us ever. He was just playing basketball
Yeah.
all the time and
Yeah.
preparing. It
Yeah.
wasn't that like, oh, I'm not interested in Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones. I'm just going to go play pickup. It's like, no, I don't have time for The Fugitive on a Friday night
Mm.
or a Tuesday afternoon in the summer. I have things I have to do.
Yeah.
And those things are drilling and footwork and preparing for my sophomore season and beyond.
Yeah. I mean, it had to have been intimidating for other high school kids and
Yeah.
guys on his team. I mean, yes, he almost single-handedly led them to the state championship, but to be a teammate of his, and I've talked to Greg, to Coach Downer. I've talked to Robbie about it. Doug and I have, had a couple of lunches, and all we did was talk about, what was it like being his teammate. And they just knew he was somebody special. He was somebody.
Yes.
They admired the fact that he had this direction. I mean, who has direction in high school, really? I mean, I didn't. I had no clue what
No,
was going on in high school.
no, and not just direction,
Yeah.
but the absolute certainty
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
he was going to become the thing that he wanted to become. And
Yeah.
that he was willing at that age to devote himself to it so single mindedly. And again, there were costs to that.
Hmm.
But I think, again, to bring it back to what we talked about earlier, that's why your book and Kobe's thoughts is laid out in it. And the term, the Mamba mentality, resonate so deeply with so many people, is that he was the embodiment of that idea that if you want something bad enough, even when you are young, and you commit yourself to it, you can achieve it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up the Mamba mentality because this is going to be kind of a lightning round. I've never done
Okay.
this on the podcast, but I'm doing it with you. Um, so the Mamba mentality, as Kobe defines it, has four pillars, right? The first pillar being obsession, second pillar being curiosity, third pillar relentlessness, and the fourth one being strength. So if I say obsession to you, give me a one sentence, two sentence kind of definition from your book, from his high school days, where this young Mamba, pre-Mamba actually started.
That's a good question. I think of it in terms of the context of his wanting to win that state championship at Lower Merion. It
Mhm.
mattered so much to him to be the best player on the best team in the state of Pennsylvania,
Mm.
and the willingness to do that. I think that in the short term of that period of his life, that was the thing that pushed him and drove him. So that's when you say obsession, and I think of that stage of Kobe's life. That's what comes to mind.
That's perfect, man. What about curiosity?
The willingness to, I think of that in terms of his academics at that stage of his
Uh-huh.
life.
Uh-huh.
The openness with which he treated other people. I think so far in our conversation, we haven't mentioned Italy very much. And I think that's a huge influence on allowing him to adjust to Lower Merion and really America once he comes back over in the way that he did. He and his family were the other in Italy. There were not many Black families there, obviously, but
Mhm.
the culture accepted him and he accepted that culture and its people in return. And I think that allowed him to kind of ease his way into the culture of Lower Merion High School.
Mm.
And so there's that openness you're talking about. And with respect to curiosity, I think you're talking about the intellectual side of Kobe Bryant. You're talking about his friendship with his mentor, Jeannie Mastriano, his honors English teacher, his sophomore year, who introduces him to the concept of the hero's journey
Mhm.
and opens him up to Greek mythology and this idea that we are not just who we are in the moment. We are striving for something bigger and
Mhm.
greater and more lasting.
Mm. Yeah, I got the opportunity to meet her when I went to Lower Merion. I did a Mamba mentality sort of event for the student body. It was like hallowed ground for me to be,
Yeah.
walking through those halls and the Kobe Bryant gymnasium and seeing those photos on the wall. It's just incredible.
Yeah.
So how about relentlessness?
Oh, gosh. Well, let's go to one game in particular.
Mhm.
The state semifinal game of his senior year at the Palestra in front of 9,000 people. Lower Merion is playing Chester High School, which is regarded as the number one, the top basketball program in the state of Pennsylvania. And 2 days before the game, Kobe's broken his nose in practice. He's collided with a teammate. He's thinking that he's going to have to wear a mask, and he tries to warm up with it and he can't do it. And he takes the mask off before the game and throws it against the wall of the locker room and says, "I'm not playing with this thing. Let's go."
Mm.
And he can't shoot. I mean, his legs are rubber. He can't make a shot in the first half of that game. And he just decides, you know what? I'm just going to go to the basket and I'm going to run the risk that I catch a stray elbow or a forearm and my broken nose gets worse and I can't play.
Mhm.
And he proceeds to score 20 points in the fourth quarter in overtime, 20 out of his game high 39. And he just says, you know what? I'm going to be relentless about going to the basket because that's what's going to help my team win.
Yeah.
And they win, and they go on the following week and win the state championship.
Yeah, that was an amazing story. I was not aware of it. I remember when he wore a mask in the NBA, he hated it, absolutely hated it. He was pulling on it all the time, but they made him, like Gary Beatty said, you're not playing unless you wear this thing because we're not going to be putting your nose back together again if you get hit again. Uh, the fourth pillar, Mike, is strength. Now, you could have used that story for strength, but what do you think of when we use that word strength?
I think of it in terms of the intellectual and emotional endurance it must have taken him to keep the secret that he wanted to go straight to the NBA.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking that at all. That's a great parallel. Yeah.
Andy, he told so few people about what he was going to do. And he didn't even tell Greg Downer. Like, not explicitly, like, Greg, he's not an idiot. He knew in his heart what Kobe was probably going to do, but Kobe never said anything. And again, in that whole idea of like putting yourself in his shoes, like, if I knew I was going to go to the NBA, I wouldn't stop myself from telling everybody, hey, I'm going to do this. This is my decision, blah, blah, blah. And he kept it quiet for so long and let the scuttlebutt bubble around him in newspapers and on TV and in the Philadelphia basketball scene. Ooh, is he going to go to Duke? Is he going to go to LaSalle? Is he really going to go to the NBA? And he kept his mouth shut.
Yeah.
When I think of strength, that's what I think of at that time of Kobe's life. And I know that's probably an unorthodox answer, but man,
no, it's a great answer.
The will it took for him to just keep that piece of information so close to the vest really marvels me.
Yeah, I mean, I feel for everyone at your alma mater, LaSalle, because they sort of thought they were going to get him. They gave Joe the job and the whole thing, and his hometown kid and all that. But the guy I felt the most for, even before I read your book, was Coach K. I mean, I love Coach K. I got to know him as actually assistant coach of the Dream Team. We all know his pedigree and what he accomplished. But at least Coach K got to coach him, with the 2008 and 2012 Olympic team. And Kobe wasn't, he was so respectful of Coach K. It did not pass him by that he broke Coach K's heart.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's an interesting dynamic too, Andy, because Kobe didn't pay much attention to college basketball.
Right.
He was so focused on the NBA that, as you said, watching the tapes of Magic and Michael and Larry Bird and Kareem, that, I remember Mike Egan, one of the assistant coaches at Lower Merion, asked him about, I didn't include this in the book, but Mike said something about asking him about a big college game that had taken place the night before. And Kobe wasn't aware of it, whether it was like Duke, North Carolina, or Carolina, Kentucky, something like that. And I always think about that in the context of his relationship with Coach K, because Duke had just won those two championships in 91 and 92, right when Kobe was back, right? Kobe returns to the States in December of 91. Duke has just won the first of its back-to-backs. Then it wins the next one the following year. And so I wonder if that made an impression on him, and led to the connection between him and Krzyzewski.
Yeah. Wow. So, Mike, coming up to the sort of the stretch run here of our interview, and it's so great talking to you, man. I mean, you and I could spend hours, and we will.
Oh, absolutely.
At one point. Tell me about the day he died, where you were, and obviously how you felt that day.
Sure. So I was in my car. I had my two sons who were, let me get this right, 8 and 5 at the time, in the back seat. I was driving home because my wife was running errands, and I was driving them home so that we could get ready to take the older one to a basketball game. And I did the thing you're not supposed to do, which is look at your phone while you're in your car. I was stopped at a traffic light, and my Twitter feed was buzzing. And I looked at what the news was, and it was that Kobe Bryant had died in a helicopter crash. And I said out loud, what the hell? Oh my God. And my 8-year-old son, Evan, actually got a little shook. He's like, is everything all right, Dad? What's the matter? And I'm like, I'll tell you when we get home. And we got home, and flipped the TV on and saw the news on CNN and NBC and anywhere else you get your news, and saw the confirmation. Um,
Mm.
had to take Evan to his basketball game. And when we got to the game, which was at about 3 o'clock Eastern time in the afternoon, there was one kid in particular. There was a game going on before Evan's, and there was a kid already he was wearing a green uniform tank top with a white T-shirt underneath of it, and he had written in black marker on the sleeve of the T-shirt, Kobe.
Right.
And I got a phone call from my editor at the Inquirer who said, "Hey, we need a Kobe Bryant column." And I said, "I totally understand."
Mm-hmm.
And I got home, and the first person I called was Jeremy Treatman, because I've known Jeremy a quarter century and we've been friends for a long time. And I think I was the one who told him that Kobe had died, because he was running a basketball tournament in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
he just said, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. And so then I went up to my office and sat down and wrote from the heart about Kobe and
Yeah.
his life.
I didn't read that column, and I would love it if you send it to me. I would just love to.
Absolutely will.
And if you
Sure.
don't mind, if we're allowed to, I would love to put that on our website.
That'd be
Um,
great.
that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Towards the end of the book, you have just such an eloquent quote. You say, "quote to listen to those tapes, to hear Kobe as 18 or 19 years old was to be whipsawed by a chilling sensation, as if a spirit had crept into the room and a warm, wistful sadness." Um, Beautifully written, man. It was the most shocking thing that ever happened to me in my life. I lost both my parents, but they had illnesses. We were sort of prepared for it. Um, I will never forget that moment. I mean, I was 5 years old when JFK was killed. I remember that like it was yesterday. We'll never get over it. None of us, obviously all his friends that and I know. Um, Question remains. I mean, did he achieve immortality? I mean, what is his legacy? What do you feel, Mike?
I think, Andy, that he did achieve it, because I think he did the thing that might have been the most surprising thing if you would talk to someone um, who viewed him, even at these early stages of his life, only through the prism of basketball, right?
Mm-hmm.
You hear all the time about coaches and athletes who are so devoted to their sports that they struggle to adjust to retirement. Okay. You see this in old college football coaches, right? Bear Bryant retires and he passes away within a few months. Joe Paterno has the scandal, end his career at Penn State, and he's gone within a couple of months.
Mm.
Kobe projected, at least outwardly, I think, to a lot of people, the image of somebody who would struggle without basketball because he was so singularly devoted to it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he didn't.
No.
He viewed basketball. It was almost like he turned himself off to it. Went ahead and moved forward pursuing storytelling and writing and filmmaking and the Mamba Academy and being a girl dad. And I do think that some of the travails that he underwent in his life, several of which were self-inflicted, lend his story and his narrative that element of immortality. It makes it resonate more with people.
Mm-hmm.
He had to come back from the depths in a way that a Michael Jordan didn't have to. And I think that adds a layer of pathos and connection for people with his story.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have verbalized that even close to the way you did. Um, After he died, almost immediately, Mike, and I'm sure you're aware of this, um, there was this outpouring of creative, I guess, grief, love, a lot of emotions, but by the art community, by the specifically muralists, mural artists all over the world. My good friend Mike Asner tracks that on his Kobe mural website and Instagram. Right now, there's 600 or so murals out there.
Yeah, it's amazing. Some
Vanessa,
of them are amazing.
It's incredible. Vanessa and I, we're working on a project to document those murals, which is amazing. For her to be able to memorialize that for her girls is what's most important to her. But never in like human history has a public figure, I mean, I think it's safe to say, elicited this much of creative love and energy, grief, in terms of murals. I mean, where's the thread there? I mean, you kind of said it. He was a human being who succeeded, who failed, who picked himself up. We could relate to him as a girl dad, all that stuff. But there's a lot of people like that, right? In public life. Why him, Mike? Why?
I think some of it is the era that we're in, where the public memorial, whether through social media or a mural or something like that, is in some ways kind of the highest honor or tribute that you can pay someone.
Mm.
I mean, that's kind of the nature of the technological and social nature of our era right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it gets to something deeper. I think it's the Mamba mentality, but it's more than that. It's this feeling of ascendancy with Kobe. That I think is part of the reason that his death hit everyone so hard,
Mm.
is that there was the feeling that there was more to come.
Mm.
Here was a guy who had spent 20 years in the NBA, had won 5 championships, had been one of the greatest athletes in American history, one of the greatest basketball players to ever live, had wanted to be this thing from the time he was small, had done it, had singularly devoted himself to it,
Mm.
had moved on from that to become, by all accounts, a better human being and to pursue other careers and other vocations that gave him the same joy that those 20 years with the Lakers had
Mm-hmm.
and his life in basketball had. And there was this expectancy to him. There was this, what else is he going to do?
Yeah.
There's a spirit within him that is pushing and striving and creating and developing. And I think that's probably what's fueling some of these kind of creative expressions in his honor, whether they're murals, whether they're a book, whether they're a film that come down the road. I think there's something, I think mystical probably goes too far, but there's
Yeah.
something deeper there.
Yeah.
And it's
Mm.
rare that you encounter that in an athlete or any kind of public popular figure.
Yeah. I mean, just going back to high school, to Janet Mastriano and her project, do you think, that's how the quote hero's journey ends? I mean, it did
I
for him.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it goes on, right?
Yeah.
I think with respect to Kobe, I think he's going to be an inspiration to hundreds of millions of people who learn about his life and read his thoughts, whether in your book or my book, or go back and see interviews with him or whatever the
Mm.
case may be,
Yeah.
and see that you know the striving is the point, the journey is the point, and what are you doing today to
Mm-hmm.
get better?
Yeah. Yeah.
The other guy's taking his break. Are you getting the extra 2 hours of training in? Are you reading something that you wouldn't have read otherwise and haven't read before? Are you experiencing something with your family that is new and different and creates a new memory? I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
people see a lot of that in him.
Yeah, he's so inspirational for me as well. I always felt like I had to bring my A game, A plus game, because he was bringing it every game, and everything
Yeah.
he did, even the book project. Um, Mike, I can't thank you enough. First of all, taking the time now to talk about this, and I also can't thank you enough for writing this book, really, because people like me who knew him, but we knew him, when he was an adult already. He's still a
Mhm.
teenager, but in Kobe world, he was an adult. So thank you for enlightening me, all of us who, really needed to know so much more about him. Um, what's next for you, man? What's the next? How do you top this, by the way? But what's next?
But that's very kind of you to say. I'm still
Yeah,
plugging away on my columns for the Inquirer.
right.
I have another book project that I'm going to be pursuing. There'll be an
Oh,
announcement about that, hopefully in the not too distant future. And otherwise, I'm going to just keep looking for good stories and
mhm.
trying to tell them as best I can.
Well, next time there's another book or anything you want to promote, you can count on us, your friends at Legends of Sport. Okay. And
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that very much.
I have a daughter in Philly, by the way. So I go to visit her,
Ah,
3-4 times a year. So
I'll
you
buy
and
you
I,
dinner.
you're in, buddy.
All right, sounds good.
Listen, man, thanks so much. And I think we're gonna run this around his birthday in August because it
Great.
seems appropriate and gives our listeners and all our followers an insight to him. I can only do so much, honestly.
Hmm.
But thank you for that, Mike. And
No,
be
thank you,
well, be
Andy.
safe. All right.
Thank you.
Well, huge thanks to Mike Sielski for taking the time to speak with me today so we can bring this podcast to all of you. Huge thanks to Mike for writing this book, which I totally recommend everyone go out and get. Anyone who's a Kobe fan, basketball fan, Laker fan, sports fan, you want to find out how somebody became great, this is the book. This is called The Rise, Kobe Bryant, and the Pursuit of Immortality. So get this book, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. I learned so much from reading this book, from doing the research, from talking to Mike. Can't wait to sit down with him over dinner, maybe have him back on the podcast sometime soon. So thanks again to Mike Sielski, and thanks to all of you, as always, for tuning in, downloading, telling your friends. Remember, folks, you can find us on the iHeart app and online, as well as Apple and Spotify and your favorite podcast platform. Keep following us, please, on Instagram at Legends of Sport, our Twitter at Legends_of Sport, our website, legendsofsport.net, and our YouTube and TikTok channels, Legends of Sport. My photography can be found on Instagram and Twitter at ADB Photo Inc. Huge shout out, as always, to my producer and head researcher, Veronica Ahn, and to the newest member of our editorial team, Kaya Ginsky. Welcome, Kaya. Great job. We'll be back next week with another great episode, folks. As always, stay safe and stay well.